The evening air in Charleston was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin and seems to make every breath feel heavy. It's the kind of air that seems to absorb sound, making even the most mundane noises feel muffled. The camera slowly panned across an overgrown courtyard, the only hint of life coming from the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the city. In the foreground, the decaying structure of what was once a grand estate stood silent and neglected, like an old ghost, unwilling to fade completely. The slave quarters, located behind the mansion, had been abandoned for decades, but something about the place seemed to hum with an energy that refused to die. A creak of old wood underfoot broke the silence, the only other sound the soft whistling of wind through broken windows. The camera moved cautiously, a slow crawl across the rotting walls, revealing a faded map pinned to a cracked doorframe. The map was yellowed with age, its once precise lines faded and curling at the edges. Beneath the map, a rusted iron lock hung loosely on a door, its mechanism long out of order, but there was something unsettling about it. The door, like everything else here, was sealed shut, yet the camera lingered on it as if something was calling from within, something hidden behind the rotting wood. Then, for a fraction of a second, the camera caught something that made the viewer's stomach drop. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the darkness. A figure, no, not quite a figure, but a shadow, just enough to make you question if your eyes were deceiving you. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, vanishing into the unseen corners of the room. A momentary flash of movement, as if the house itself had a memory. But before anyone could focus on it, the camera moved again, this time following the path of a thin, broken beam stretching across a rotting ceiling. The entire room, now exposed to the light, seemed to groan in protest, as if the structure had once held something far more ominous than just dust and decay. The chilling uncertainty of that moment, was it a trick of the light, or something darker, more ancient, lingered in the air. As the camera swept through the ruins of the estate, the viewer's unease grew, filling the space with a strange sense of anticipation. There was something inside this building, something that had never been fully explained, yet it felt as though it was still watching, waiting for something. Then, a voice broke the silence. It was low, almost a whisper, as if trying not to disturb the ghosts of the past. No rats. No snakes. But something was always wrong here. Something you can't explain. The voice belonged to a local historian, an elderly woman whose family had lived in Charleston for generations. She had walked these streets as a child, heard the old stories, and listened to the warnings that had been passed down about the slave quarters. Her words were heavy with the weight of history, but they also held a quiet urgency. Something had happened in these quarters, something that defied logic and reason. And it was time for those who had never known the truth to finally understand what had been hidden. The woman spoke of a time long ago, when the estate had been bustling with life, though not in a way anyone would have wanted to experience. The slave quarters had been home to men, women, and children who were treated as property, their lives marked by pain, fear, and the heavy chains of oppression. The estate had once been the heart of Charleston's wealth, built on the backs of those who toiled in silence, their lives nothing more than shadows in the eyes of those who lived in the grand mansions. But the quarters had always been different. There was something about them, something that unsettled even the most hardened plantation owners. The first signs of trouble had come not from the slaves themselves, but from the space they were forced to inhabit. The strange happenings had started small, a door creaking open on its own, a flicker of movement in the corner of an eye, but they grew. In time, they became impossible to ignore. And yet, no one had ever dared to speak openly of what was happening. The people who lived in Charleston, the ones who had power, wealth, and influence, found ways to explain away the inexplicable. It was easier to pretend that the strange noises were just the wind, that the sudden chill was nothing more than a draft. The idea of ghosts, of spirits tied to the land by the suffering they had endured, was simply too much for most people to bear. But for the ones who had lived there, who had experienced the unexplainable, there was no longer any doubt. Something had been left behind in those slave quarters, something that had never left. As the camera continued to roam through the abandoned space, the viewer felt the sense of unease grow, like a cold hand creeping up the spine. The building itself seemed to pulse with an energy that was both oppressive and impossible to escape. In the distance, there was a faint echo, like the sound of someone, shuffling through the decaying rooms. Was it just the wind, or was it something else entirely? A soft rustle of paper on the floor could be heard, as though the documents that had been abandoned here for years were stirring, waiting to reveal their secrets. The camera paused on a photograph framed on the wall, a faded black and white image of a family standing outside the mansion. In the center was a man dressed in the finery of a plantation owner, flanked by his wife and children. But behind them, hidden in the shadows of the doorway, was another figure, a man, no taller than a boy, his face obscured. He had been caught in the background of a moment in time, yet his presence in the image was unmistakable. This was no ordinary photograph. This was a record of something else, something that no one had ever noticed before. The family in the picture, smiling and proud, had no idea that their legacy would one day be linked to something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The historian's voice grew quiet again, a haunted note creeping into her words. The stories, they're not just stories. They're warnings. They're a part of the land now. The camera zoomed out, showing the decaying walls of the quarters, the once thriving estate now reduced to a rotting skeleton of its former self. And yet, despite the decay, there was an undeniable sense that something was still there, still clinging to the space, as if the very earth had absorbed the trauma of centuries. The slave quarters had never truly let go, and perhaps they never would. The mystery of Charleston's slave quarters was only just beginning to unfold. But for those brave enough to search for the truth, the questions were becoming more urgent. What had truly happened here? What had been left behind? And who, or what, was still waiting for answers? Charleston's history is as rich as it is dark, a story built upon the backs of those who were forced into servitude, whose labor fueled the city's growth and prosperity. Long before the first bricks of the grand mansions were laid, long before the streets became a bustling center of culture and commerce, the land was already soaked with the weight of tragedy. The origins of Charleston can be traced back to the early 1670s, when European settlers arrived on the shores of the Carolinas and began to establish the city that would grow into one of the wealthiest in America. The settlers, many of them English, had come seeking fortune and freedom, but what they found was a land rich in resources, and a system of exploitation that would come to define the city's existence for centuries. At first, the settlers relied on a system of indentured servitude, but that was a short-lived solution. As the need for labor grew, the city turned to a darker, more permanent system, the African slave trade. Charleston, with its deep-water port, became a central hub in this transatlantic trade, one of the busiest slave markets in the entire Western Hemisphere. Over the course of the 18th century, thousands of African men, women, and children were brought to Charleston, sold to wealthy plantation owners who saw them as nothing more than property to be used and discarded. The wealth generated from the labor of these enslaved people allowed Charleston to flourish, and soon, grand mansions and stately buildings began to rise along the city streets. But as the wealth of the elite grew, so too did the need to control those who had no rights. The system of slavery demanded not only labor but also subjugation, an arrangement that required the strictest form of control. The creation of the slave quarters was a direct result of this desire for control. These were no longer mere outbuildings for servants, they were purpose-built spaces designed to isolate, dehumanize, and break the spirit of those who were forced to live in them. The first of these quarters appeared in the early 1700s, located behind the grand plantation houses where the enslaved were kept out of sight and out of mind. These buildings were often little more than cramped, poorly constructed structures, often made from cheap materials, wooden slats, poorly fitted roofs, and small, dark windows that let in little light. The conditions inside were abysmal. Families of up to 10 or 12 people were crowded into tiny spaces, sleeping on straw mats or, when the resources were available, on the bare floors. There was little to no ventilation, and disease spread quickly in the stifling heat. Many of the enslaved people had no choice but to endure these living conditions, for there was no other option. The construction of these slave quarters was both a physical and psychological effort. The location behind the mansions, away from the eyes of the elite, symbolized the segregation of those who lived there. But the physical separation also created an emotional and mental barrier. The slave quarters were often placed in isolated parts of the estate, far from the main house, to reinforce the idea that those living there were not part of the larger world. They were cut off, forgotten, reduced to nothing more than tools in the eyes of the landowners. This separation was meant to ensure that the enslaved never felt as though they belonged, never felt as though they had value beyond the labor they provided. The grand homes of Charleston's wealthy elite stood in stark contrast to the conditions in which the enslaved lived. The plantation owners lived in luxury, their homes filled with fine furnishings, ornate decor, and spacious rooms that allowed for the easy display of wealth. In contrast, the slave quarters were designed for efficiency, not comfort, and certainly not for dignity. This physical contrast, the towering mansions and the decrepit slave quarters, created a haunting visual, one that symbolized the deep inequalities of the time. Even as the city prospered, there were subtle signs of strain. The people living in the slave quarters were not immune to the hardships of life. Disease, hunger, and brutal treatment from overseers and masters led to a constant state of unrest. Yet, despite these brutal conditions, the enslaved people found ways to hold on to their culture, their traditions, and their sense of identity. They forged communities, creating bonds that would survive even the worst abuses. But there was a sense of dread in the air, a feeling that something darker was simmering just beneath the surface. Over time, the enslaved began to notice the strange occurrences, the things that couldn't be explained away, no matter how hard they tried. The first whisperings of these strange events were small. A door that would swing open on its own. Footsteps heard when no one was around. Voices coming from empty rooms. It started innocently enough, little things that could be easily dismissed as tricks of the mind. But the longer the quarters stood, the more the stories grew, as if the very space itself had absorbed the pain and suffering of those who lived within it. The space became something more than just a building. It became a repository of sorrow and anger, a place where the boundaries between the physical world and the supernatural began to blur. At first, these occurrences were dismissed by those who lived outside the quarters. The wealthy landowners, when they heard the rumors, brushed them off as superstition, the product of a people who were too oppressed and desperate to make sense of their reality. But those who had lived in the quarters, who had to endure the oppressive conditions, knew better. They knew something was wrong. Something that could not be explained by reason or logic. The air felt different in the quarters. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, as though the walls themselves had witnessed too much pain to ever be truly at peace. As the decades passed and the number of enslaved people continued to rise, the reports of strange happenings only increased. But even as the mystery deepened, few dared to speak openly about what was happening. The stories were passed down in hushed tones, whispered among the elders, but never fully acknowledged. After all, the history of Charleston, the history of slavery, was one that many were desperate to forget. To speak of it too openly was to acknowledge the sins of the past, sins that still haunted the city in ways that no one could fully understand. And yet, despite the silence, there were always those who couldn't ignore the strange, inexplicable things happening within the slave quarters. There were always those who felt the pull of the mystery, who sought answers in the face of fear. Some came from outside Charleston, drawn by the stories, the rumors that clung to the land like a curse. Others, born and raised in the city, found themselves haunted by the strange occurrences that no one could explain. The stories of Charleston's slave quarters, with all their darkness and mystery, were just beginning. The legacy of the past would not be so easily forgotten, and the secrets buried within those walls were waiting to be uncovered. The history of Charleston's slave quarters was not just a history of oppression and suffering. It was a history of something more, something that had seeped into the very fabric of the land. The slave quarters were more than just buildings. They were symbols of a dark, hidden truth that had yet to be fully understood. And as the mystery continued to unfold, the question remained, what had truly happened in those quarters? What dark secrets were still buried there, waiting to be revealed? The story of Charleston's slave quarters was far from over. It was only just beginning. In the early years following the construction of the slave quarters in Charleston, the stories of strange occurrences began to surface, disconnected whispers that seemed to rise from the shadows of the city's past. It was impossible to ignore the unease that settled over the area, but for a long time, those who lived outside the quarters were quick to dismiss the unsettling stories. The wealthy landowners, the church leaders, and the political elite, who had built Charleston on the backs of the enslaved, were uninterested in giving credence to the rumors. They had too much at stake, too much power, to acknowledge the presence of something beyond their control, something that defied their understanding of the world. It was the people who lived closest to the quarters, those who worked the fields or served in the mansions, who began to notice the first signs of something amiss. At first, it was nothing more than whispers, brief mentions of a door that wouldn't stay shut, strange sounds heard in the dead of night, and unsettling visions glimpsed through the cracks of the quarter's crumbling walls. These early reports were often dismissed as superstition, the products of overheated minds, tired from the brutal labor of the day. But there was something undeniable about the way these stories began to accumulate. The first anomalies were subtle, almost imperceptible. At night, the sound of footsteps would echo through the corridors of the quarters, the faint shuffle of shoes on the wooden floors. But when the door was opened, there would be no one there. The footsteps would stop, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking had simply vanished. A servant might leave a room only to return a short time later to find a chair had been moved or an object had shifted position. At first, these were small occurrences, things that could easily be written off as tricks of the mind, things that were easily ignored in the chaos of everyday life. But as time went on, the frequency of these events grew, and so did the sense of unease that accompanied them. The strange occurrences seemed to happen most often at night, when the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. In the early days, it was a common belief that the quarters were simply too old, too poorly built to stand against the elements. The wind would rattle the windows, the wooden beams would creak, and the floors would groan. But the sounds coming from within the quarters didn't always have an explanation. It wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't just the house settling. There was a strange, unnerving quality to the noises that left a deep, lingering impression on those who heard them. Perhaps the most disturbing of the early signs were the cold spots that would appear in the most unexpected places. A room that had been warm just moments before would suddenly grow icy, a bone-chilling coldness that could not be explained by the weather. People would step into these cold spots and feel as though they had walked into another world, a world that didn't quite fit with the one they knew. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the cold would dissipate, leaving the room as warm as it had been before. Those who had the misfortune to experience these sudden chills couldn't help but feel as though they were being watched, an unsettling sensation that would linger long after they had left the quarters. In addition to these physical anomalies, there were also the sightings. The first reports of strange figures appeared only a few years after the slave quarters had been established. People walking past the building in the dead of night would sometimes catch glimpses of figures moving behind the grimy, barred windows. They were always fleeting, never enough to make out clearly, but they were there, shadows that seemed to shift, shapes that didn't belong. The figures were never the same, and there was no pattern to their appearances. Sometimes, they would be seen moving across the window, other times, they would appear to be watching from inside. But when the curious would knock on the door or enter the building to investigate, they would find nothing. No person, no shadow. Only the eerie, hollow silence of a building that seemed to be alive with its own secret. For those who lived in the area, these sightings were enough to make them start talking. They were hesitant at first, unsure whether to believe their own eyes. But as more and more people reported seeing the same thing, the stories began to spread. Some claimed they had seen figures that appeared to be dressed in clothing from a time long past, ancient garments that seemed out of place in the modern world. Others described shadows that didn't move in a way that seemed natural, figures that lingered for too long or shifted in ways that defied logic. The whispers of these early sightings reached the ears of the local community, but most people dismissed them as nothing more than folklore. Charleston's wealthy elite, who controlled the city's economy and cultural narrative, had no interest in encouraging stories that could tarnish their reputation. The idea of ghosts, of spirits haunting the land, was something they would rather ignore. To speak openly of such things was to acknowledge a side of history they wanted to forget, an uncomfortable reminder of the brutality and inhumanity that had built their wealth. So, the stories remained confined to hushed conversations in dark corners, shared only by those who had lived through the strange events themselves. But despite the public denial, there were always those who couldn't let go of the questions. The local population, the ones who had spent years living in the shadow of the slave quarters, couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. It wasn't just the cold spots or the figures in the window, it was the oppressive atmosphere of the place. There was a heaviness in the air that seemed to cling to the walls, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. It wasn't just the building itself, it was the land, the history, the suffering that had taken place there. The more people tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. One of the first to truly begin investigating these anomalies was a local historian named Thomas Barrow. Barrow, unlike many of his contemporaries, was deeply fascinated by the history of Charleston, particularly the hidden, darker aspects of its past. He had grown up hearing the stories of the slave quarters and had witnessed firsthand the strange occurrences that plagued the area. Barrow wasn't quick to dismiss these events as superstition. He believed there was something more to the stories, something that needed to be uncovered. He began collecting reports, speaking with locals who had witnessed strange occurrences, and piecing together a narrative that had long been ignored. His research led him to uncover a disturbing pattern, a link between the strange occurrences and the suffering of those who had been enslaved in the quarters. The more Barrow learned about the history of the building, the more he realized that it wasn't just the architecture or the natural elements that were causing the disturbances. It was the weight of the pain, the loss, and the trauma that had been buried within those walls. The restless spirits of those who had lived and died there seemed to linger, unable to move on. And they weren't content to remain silent. The anomalies that had been dismissed as coincidence now began to take on a deeper meaning. It wasn't just the occasional cold spot or the fleeting shadow in the window, it was something much more profound, something that couldn't be ignored. The slave quarters had become a vessel for something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The strange occurrences were not just the result of aging wood and the passage of time. They were the echoes of a history that refused to be silenced. And with each new anomaly, the mystery deepened, pulling those who sought answers into a world that was beyond their comprehension. The stories had always circulated in the shadows, whispered among those who lived in Charleston's poorest quarters, but soon, they began to surface with an unsettling frequency. At first, it was the servants who worked in the mansions nearby, the ones tasked with the daily chores who had the closest proximity to the slave quarters. Their accounts seemed to come from the edges of the known world, stories that were ignored or ridiculed by the town's elite. Yet, there was a growing number of people who couldn't dismiss the strange occurrences, and among them, the voices of those who had witnessed the anomalies firsthand began to emerge. In the beginning, the reports were small, fleeting moments, casual mentions of strange happenings, passed off as part of the natural order of things. One of the first to speak openly about it was a woman named Mary Whitaker, who had worked as a servant in one of the grand houses near the slave quarters. She had long heard the rumors from the other servants, stories of things that couldn't be explained, of doors that slammed shut on their own, of strange cold winds that swept through the rooms despite the heat of summer. But it wasn't until Mary began working in the kitchen one evening when she first experienced something she couldn't easily dismiss. That night, the mansion she worked for had been unusually quiet. The mistress of the house had taken her children to the city for an event, leaving the house nearly deserted. The other servants were busy with their own chores, leaving Mary to prepare the evening meal alone. She remembered the oppressive stillness of the house as she worked, the distant echo of her footsteps on the marble floors. But as she passed by the back of the house, near the windows that overlooked the slave quarters, she felt a sudden unease, an inexplicable sense of being watched. At first, she thought it was just the isolation of the house getting to her, but as she moved closer to the window, she swore she saw a figure standing in the dark courtyard beyond. The figure was tall, its features hidden by the darkness, and for a moment, Mary thought it might be one of the enslaved workers returning to the quarters after a long day. But then, something about the figure's posture seemed wrong, unnatural. It stood rigid, almost as if frozen in place, staring toward the house. Mary's breath caught in her chest. The air around her seemed to shift, growing heavier. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She blinked, and when her eyes returned to the spot where she had seen the figure, it was gone. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to go outside and investigate or return to the safety of the kitchen. But before she could move, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the slave quarters. The sound was followed by a low, guttural moan, like the groan of a building settling under an immense weight. The hair on her arms stood on end. She hurried to the window, peering into the dark courtyard, but there was nothing, no figure, no movement. The quiet returned, punctuated only by the distant sound of a dog barking. Mary had never been one to jump to conclusions, but the events of that night lingered with her for days. She couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure, standing motionless in the dark. She couldn't explain it, but she knew one thing for certain: something was not right in the vicinity of those slave quarters. Soon after her experience, she confided in a fellow servant, an older woman named Eleanor, who had worked in Charleston for years and had heard the rumors surrounding the quarters long before Mary had arrived. Eleanor's response wasn't one of surprise, it was a quiet acknowledgement, as though she had known all along. "You're not the first to see things there," Eleanor whispered one evening, as the two women worked together in the kitchen. "I've heard the stories. I've seen some of it myself, though I'll never speak of it outside these walls. People are afraid to say anything, but that place, it has a history." Over time, more and more witnesses began to come forward, though none of them were willing to go public with their experiences. These were not the sorts of stories that were accepted in Charleston's high society. To suggest that something supernatural might be at play in the slave quarters was to risk being labeled mad, deluded, or simply prone to superstition. But as the testimonies mounted, it became clear that the strange occurrences were not just limited to one or two isolated incidents. One of the most compelling accounts came from a young man named Thomas Carter, a stable boy who had worked for a wealthy plantation owner just outside the city. Thomas had never been one to believe in ghosts, but when he was tasked with tending to the horses near the slave quarters, he began to question his certainty. One evening, as he led a horse to the stable, he noticed that the door to the slave quarters was ajar. A strange flickering light appeared from within, casting long shadows across the yard. At first, he thought it might be the lantern of one of the workers. But as he got closer, the light seemed to dance unnaturally, flickering in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though someone was moving the flame intentionally. He stepped closer to investigate but hesitated when he heard a soft whisper, a voice that sounded as though it was calling his name. The voice was too faint to be understood, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He called out, but no one responded. He reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly, and pushed it open. The moment he crossed the threshold, a cold gust of wind hit him, sending chills through his entire body. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Inside the quarters, there was no one. No light, no sound. Only the oppressive silence. Thomas had no explanation for what he felt that night. He didn't see anyone. He didn't hear any footsteps. But something intangible, was in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a feeling of dread settled over him like a weight. He hurried back to the stable, his heart pounding in his chest. From that night onward, he couldn't shake the feeling that the slave quarters were not just abandoned buildings, they were something more. They were something alive, something that watched from the shadows. As more witnesses came forward with their own accounts, a clearer picture began to emerge. It was no longer just the occasional flicker of movement or the cold spots that could be written off as a trick of the mind. There was something deliberate about the way the strange events played out. There was a pattern to the anomalies, a sense that they were happening for a reason, that they were not simply random occurrences. And as the whispers grew louder, more people began to wonder, was it possible that the slave quarters were haunted by the souls of those who had suffered there? Was it possible that the restless spirits of the enslaved were still trying to make their presence known, unable to find peace? As the tales of eerie happenings began to weave through the streets of Charleston, a sense of tension began to grow. The strange occurrences at the slave quarters were no longer just a local curiosity, they were becoming something far more dangerous. People were starting to question what lay behind the mysterious events. And in doing so, they were uncovering a far darker, far more unsettling truth than they could have ever imagined. As the reports of strange occurrences continued to spread throughout Charleston, there was a growing sense of unease that gripped the city. But rather than acknowledge the possibility that something truly supernatural was at work, the city's elites, the clergy, and the political establishment quickly moved to suppress these rumors, pushing them back into the shadows where they could not tarnish the image of Charleston as a prosperous, civilized place. The people who lived in the grand mansions of Charleston's historic district had built their wealth and influence on the backs of the enslaved, and any suggestion that their estates were haunted or cursed was simply too dangerous to allow to spread. In a city that prided itself on its wealth, sophistication, and cultured reputation, such stories could not be allowed to flourish. The first line of defense came from the local clergy. Ministers, priests, and religious leaders were often the moral backbone of the community, holding sway over public opinion. In the eyes of the religious elite, the idea of spirits wandering the earth, particularly the spirits of the enslaved, was not only unacceptable but blasphemous. In Charleston, where the religious institution wielded considerable power, the clergy had long been invested in maintaining social order, and they could not afford for any challenge to that order to take root. If supernatural forces were at play, it would suggest that the divine order was out of balance, and that was an idea that could not be tolerated. For many of Charleston's wealthy families, religion served as a shield against the darker implications of their actions. They had used the pulpit to justify their ownership of slaves, promoting the belief that enslaving people was part of a divinely ordained structure. This gave them a moral veneer, an excuse for the brutality that defined their lives. So when the rumors of hauntings began to grow, the clergy immediately pushed back, framing the events as symptoms of weakness, delusions created by the oppressed, the emotionally fragile, or the superstitious. The more unsettling reports were dismissed as hysteria, a form of mass mental illness brought on by the stresses of living under such extreme conditions. Father Jacobson, the head priest of one of Charleston's largest churches, publicly denounced the rumors surrounding the slave quarters. He addressed his congregation with vehemence, asserting that the people who claimed to have seen spirits were either lying or misled by their own fears and ignorance. He called the stories of ghosts and hauntings satanic, and warned his parishioners not to entertain such thoughts. The devil, he preached, seeks to sow discord in our hearts. He whispers lies to those who are weak of mind. Do not fall prey to his deceptions. His words were not without impact. They silenced many. Those who had dared to speak up about their experiences were now ashamed to be publicly associated with what was being labeled as madness. And while the most vocal witnesses, those who had seen the strange figures or heard the unexplained noises, began to retreat into silence, the unease in Charleston did not dissipate. The whispers continued, albeit quieter now, spread only by those who had experienced the unsettling phenomena firsthand. The clergy's stance, while effective in quelling public discussions, had deeper implications. For those who worked in the houses near the slave quarters, the servants, the laborers, and the tradesmen, there was now a profound sense of isolation. The church was supposed to provide solace and support, but instead, it became an instrument of denial. People who were already living on the edges of society now found themselves forced into further silence, their personal experiences invalidated by the very institution that should have been their refuge. But the stories did not simply vanish. Those who had lived in close proximity to the slave quarters were not easily silenced. They knew what they had seen, what they had felt. The truth of the quarters, the inexplicable occurrences, the haunting atmosphere, remained etched in their minds. Though the public discourse shifted to one of skepticism and denial, the community's collective memory refused to forget. The most persistent of these witnesses began to meet in secret, sharing their accounts of what they had seen. These gatherings were furtive, occurring behind closed doors in dimly lit rooms, away from prying eyes. They spoke in hushed tones, knowing that to voice their concerns publicly would mark them as outcasts, madmen, or worse, heretics. But in their private conversations, the story never truly died. One of the most vocal proponents of this underground resistance was a man named Samuel Blake, a former overseer who had worked on a plantation neighboring the one that owned the slave quarters. Samuel had long been known as a pragmatic man, someone who dealt in facts and reason. But after working on the plantation, after spending so many nights in the shadow of the slave quarters, he began to notice the same strange occurrences that had plagued others. Samuel was no stranger to hardship, and the pressures of his work had taught him to ignore his own discomfort. But even he could not deny what he had felt in the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the slave quarters. His nerves had begun to fray, and on more than one occasion, he had experienced what could only be described as unexplainable phenomena. Samuel had witnessed doors closing by themselves, heard the muffled sounds of footsteps in the hallways when no one was around, and even seen the figure of a man standing motionless in a corner of the yard, a figure that disappeared when he blinked. At first, he tried to explain it away: tiredness, hunger, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. But after a while, the evidence became undeniable. And yet, when he brought his concerns to his colleagues, they dismissed him. To suggest that a spirit could be haunting the slave quarters was not only foolish, it was dangerous. It threatened the delicate balance of Charleston's social structure. Samuel, however, could not remain silent. He began to seek out others who had witnessed similar events. Over time, he formed a small group of like-minded individuals, mostly servants, former slaves, and other marginalized members of Charleston society. Together, they exchanged their stories and speculated on the nature of the haunting. They talked about the restless spirits of those who had suffered in the quarters, the lives cut short by the brutality of slavery, and the curse that seemed to linger in the land. Though their discussions were private, the fear of being discovered weighed heavily on them. One of the group's members, an older woman named Sarah, had worked in the household of a prominent plantation owner for over 20 years. She had seen the full brutality of the system, the lashes, the forced labor, the broken bodies, and she had witnessed the strange phenomena in the quarters for as long as she could remember. Yet, even Sarah, with her years of experience, could not bring herself to speak openly. "The world is not ready to hear the truth," she would often say. "If we speak of it, they will call us mad, or worse, blasphemers." Despite their fears, the group continued to meet in secret, their resolve growing stronger with each passing day. The more they spoke, the more they realized that the slave quarters were not just haunted by the souls of those who had suffered there, they were cursed by the very land itself. The land that had been stained with the blood of the enslaved, the land that had borne witness to unimaginable cruelty, now seemed to be filled with a malevolent energy that refused to die. But the public face of Charleston would not be swayed. The religious and political establishment continued to suppress any discussion of the supernatural, keeping the mystery of the slave quarters buried beneath layers of denial. As long as the stories remained hidden in the shadows, the city's image as a wealthy, thriving port town remained intact. For those who lived in the margins of society, however, the haunting continued, unacknowledged, unspoken, but undeniably present. The curse of the slave quarters was a secret that would not be silenced, no matter how hard the powers that be tried to suppress it. As the years wore on, the strange occurrences within the slave quarters began to intensify. What had once been minor anomalies, brief flickers of movement in the corner of an eye, the occasional cold draft in an otherwise warm room, became harder to ignore. The events began to escalate, becoming more frequent and increasingly disturbing. The people who lived near the quarters, those who worked nearby or had reason to pass through the area, started to feel the psychological weight of the place in ways they never had before. The slave quarters had always been a source of fear, but now, that fear was growing more tangible, more oppressive, as if the very air around the building had begun to shift in response to the increasing intensity of the activity within. One of the most noticeable changes was the growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate the area surrounding the quarters. For those who had once brushed off the oddities as superstition or mere imagination, the intensity of what was now happening became impossible to deny. The land itself seemed to have absorbed the suffering that had taken place there, the brutality, the pain, the loss. It was as though the earth had become a conduit for the trauma of the past, and now that energy was rising to the surface, demanding attention. Those who lived and worked nearby began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they were in proximity to the building. It was as if something, some unseen force, was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake, to falter. It wasn't just the workers who felt it. Even those who had once been confident in their skepticism began to question their reality. One such man was John Hargrove, a former overseer who had served on a nearby plantation. John had never been one to indulge in superstitions. His life had been built on reason, logic, and an unshakable belief in the tangible world. He had heard the rumors, of course, and he had always dismissed them as the product of hysterical minds. But that changed one evening when he was forced to pass near the slave quarters on his way home from a long day's work. At first, John didn't think anything of it. It was a warm evening, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The slave quarters loomed in the distance, their dilapidated forms casting an eerie silhouette against the horizon. But as he drew closer, he felt a sudden unease, an inexplicable tension in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He quickened his pace, but the feeling intensified. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, as though the earth itself were alive with some hidden force. When John reached the edge of the property, he heard something. It was faint at first, just a low, indistinct sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as he listened, the whisper became clearer, more distinct. It sounded like voices, soft, almost melodic, as though they were calling to him from the darkness. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voices seemed to be coming from within the slave quarters, but when he looked toward the building, there was no movement. No sign of anyone nearby. The voices continued to rise and fall, a chorus of murmurs that seemed to surround him, suffocating him in their proximity. John took a step back, his pulse racing, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. He wanted to run, but his feet felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply, and a chill ran down his spine. He turned on his heel and made his way back to the safety of the main house, but the voices followed him. They seemed to echo in his ears, growing louder and more frantic with each step. By the time he reached his door, John was shaken, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm in the face of adversity, but now he was filled with a deep sense of unease that he couldn't explain. He knew something had changed in that moment. He had felt it in his bones. There was something wrong with the slave quarters. Something that couldn't be dismissed as superstition. The feeling lingered with him for days, and he found himself unable to shake the memory of the voices. He could no longer walk past the quarters without feeling that same oppressive weight on his chest. It wasn't just John who was affected. Other people in Charleston, many of them hardened by years of dealing with the hardships of daily life, began to show signs of psychological distress after encountering the slave quarters. Workers who passed by the building would often return in a state of agitation, their minds clouded with a sense of dread. Some reported feeling as though they were being followed, others claimed to hear faint whispers or the sound of footsteps behind them, even though they were alone. The tension in the area continued to mount, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Those who were closest to the slave quarters, the servants, the laborers, the former slaves, began to feel as though they were losing their grip on reality. It wasn't just that the place was haunted by spirits, it was as if the land itself was feeding off the fear and the trauma that had taken place there. One woman, a former housemaid named Clara, was one of the most vocal witnesses to the psychological effects that the quarters were having on people. She had spent much of her childhood in the shadow of the slave quarters, working in the nearby mansion. Clara was known for her calm demeanor and practical nature, but even she could not deny the strange feelings of fear and anxiety that seemed to grip her whenever she passed by the building. It was as though the quarters were calling to her, pulling her in, forcing her to confront something she could not fully understand. For Clara, the fear was not just in the physical presence of the building but in the way it seemed to warp the very air around it. She described walking past the quarters on her way to work one morning, when she suddenly felt a crushing pressure on her chest. The air seemed to thin, as though she was struggling to breathe, and her heart began to race. Her vision blurred, and for a brief moment, she felt as though she was drowning. The sensation passed as quickly as it came, but the lingering effect was undeniable. Clara spoke of feeling a deep sense of foreboding whenever she went near the slave quarters, an overwhelming sense that something was waiting for her, watching her, just beyond the veil of reality. For those who had worked and lived in the slave quarters, the psychological toll was even more profound. Many of the former slaves, who had been forced to live in the quarters under brutal conditions, found themselves unable to escape the haunting memories of their past. They spoke of dreams, vivid, nightmarish visions of the quarters, of the suffering they had endured there. They would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, their hearts pounding in their chests. It was as though the building itself had become a prison for their memories, a place where their suffering could not be escaped, even in death. The once quiet whispers of the supernatural were now replaced with a palpable sense of fear and dread. The psychological toll on those who had come into contact with the slave quarters was becoming undeniable. The more the strange events escalated, the more it became clear that the land was not just haunted by the ghosts of the enslaved, it was haunted by the very weight of the past, by the memories of those who had lived and died in pain, by the land that had been scarred by centuries of suffering. The question was no longer whether the slave quarters were haunted, it was how much longer anyone could endure the overwhelming sense of darkness that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. And for those who could no longer deny the presence of something otherworldly, the fear was not just about what haunted the slave quarters, but what it might do to them next. As the strange events surrounding Charleston's slave quarters continued to escalate, many were desperate for a logical explanation. Skepticism still ran deep through the city's upper echelons, and in an attempt to bring some clarity to the increasingly unnerving situation, several scientists, doctors, and even local academics took it upon themselves to investigate the phenomena. Their motivations ranged from a genuine curiosity about the supernatural to a more pragmatic desire to protect Charleston's reputation. The slave quarters, once a remote and ignored part of the city, had become a focal point of mystery, and the elite, who had long worked to keep their social and economic foundations intact, could not afford to let rumors of hauntings and curses gain traction in the public sphere. Thus, these learned men ventured into the heart of the mystery, eager to dispel what they perceived to be nothing more than superstition. Among those who took an interest in the occurrences was Dr. Edward Mitchell, a prominent physician who had recently arrived in Charleston. Dr. Mitchell was known for his keen scientific mind and his tendency to dismiss anything that did not fit into the framework of reason and logic. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or irrational beliefs. But as he began to hear more and more stories of the strange happenings at the slave quarters, he became intrigued. There had to be a scientific explanation, he reasoned, a natural phenomenon at play, something that could be observed, measured, and understood. There was no room for the supernatural in his worldview, and he was determined to prove that the eerie occurrences could be attributed to nothing more than environmental factors or psychological responses. Dr. Mitchell's first hypothesis was that the strange noises and feelings of dread experienced by those near the slave quarters were the result of the building's dilapidated state. Over the years, the slave quarters had fallen into disrepair, with cracks in the walls, rotting wood, and an overall sense of decay. Mitchell believed that these structural issues might be causing a phenomenon known as building-induced anxiety, a condition in which the environment itself creates a psychological response in those who inhabit it. According to Mitchell, the creaking of the floors, the shifting of the beams, and the eerie sounds of wind whistling through the broken windows were all part of this anxiety-inducing atmosphere. The human mind, when placed in such an environment, might begin to project fears and anxieties onto the surroundings, interpreting these natural sounds as something more sinister. Mitchell's theory seemed plausible at first glance, and he began to gather data. He spent several nights near the slave quarters, taking notes on the sounds and the physical sensations reported by those who lived nearby. He even enlisted the help of some of the workers, asking them to keep journals of their experiences and to track the conditions under which these strange occurrences seemed to happen. To his surprise, the accounts were consistent. There were definite patterns to when and where the anomalies took place. The noises, for example, seemed to occur most frequently when the weather was particularly humid or when the wind was blowing from the south. Mitchell theorized that the wind could be causing the old, unstable structure to creak and groan in ways that triggered feelings of unease in those nearby. The cold spots, too, might be explained by drafts or shifts in air pressure. However, as Mitchell delved deeper into the mystery, he began to encounter strange contradictions that couldn't be easily explained by his scientific approach. There were reports of individuals feeling a sudden drop in temperature in areas where no draft could be detected, or of seeing shadowy figures in places that should have been completely empty. On one occasion, a worker claimed to have seen a figure standing in the window of the quarters, only to find no one inside when they went to investigate. Mitchell couldn't deny that these events didn't fit neatly into his hypothesis. Yet, he remained determined to find a rational explanation. He theorized that the minds of the people involved were playing tricks on them, that stress, fatigue, and even suggestion could be responsible for the visual hallucinations and feelings of dread. He suggested that the residents and workers near the quarters were simply predisposed to interpret ambiguous stimuli in a way that confirmed their own beliefs in supernatural forces. But Dr. Mitchell wasn't the only one trying to make sense of the strange happenings at the slave quarters. Another theory emerged from a local geologist, Professor Richard Alston, who believed that there could be a natural cause for the disturbances. Alston was intrigued by the idea that the land on which the slave quarters had been built could somehow be responsible for the strange events. He had heard rumors of haunted properties around the world where certain geological conditions were thought to cause inexplicable phenomena, and he wondered if something similar was happening in Charleston. Alston's hypothesis was based on the presence of certain minerals in the soil and the possibility of underground water sources that could create an electromagnetic field. According to Alston, these fields could have an effect on the human brain, causing hallucinations, feelings of paranoia, and even physical sensations like chills and headaches. Alston was not a man to leave things to chance. He organized several expeditions to study the soil around the slave quarters, carefully analyzing the composition and testing for traces of certain minerals that could be creating such effects. He also mapped the area's water sources, hoping to uncover any links between underground rivers or reservoirs and the reports of cold spots and unexplained sensations. Alston was convinced that there had to be a rational, natural explanation for what people were experiencing. But after weeks of research, he found no evidence of any unusual geological activity in the area. The soil was typical of the region, and there were no significant underground water sources that would explain the phenomena. With both Mitchell and Alston's theories failing to provide satisfactory answers, another theory gained traction within the scientific community: the psychological effects of mass hysteria. This theory suggested that the people who lived and worked near the slave quarters were being affected by a form of collective delusion, a psychological contagion that spread through the community like wildfire. According to this theory, the constant stories of strange occurrences had created a feedback loop in which the people living in the area began to experience symptoms of fear, anxiety, and paranoia that were exaggerated by their own imaginations. In this case, the power of suggestion, coupled with the deeply ingrained beliefs in spirits and the supernatural, was enough to trigger hallucinations and heightened emotional responses. While this theory had some merit, it did little to explain the more tangible aspects of the events. How, for example, could one explain the cold spots that seemed to appear in specific rooms, or the strange shadows that appeared on the walls at all hours of the day. How could an entire community be affected by the same psychological phenomena? And why did these occurrences seem to intensify over time, instead of fading away as one would expect from a mass hysteria event? As the days passed and the explanations grew more convoluted, one thing became increasingly clear: the mystery surrounding the slave quarters was not going to be solved through reason and science alone. The theories, while compelling in their own right, all seemed to fall short when confronted with the sheer intensity of the events. The people who had experienced these phenomena were not simply succumbing to suggestion, they were experiencing something real, something that transcended conventional explanations. And no matter how many theories were proposed or how many investigations were conducted, the truth of what was happening in the slave quarters remained elusive, shrouded in a veil of uncertainty and fear. In the end, the scientific community's attempts to rationalize the events only deepened the mystery, leaving the people of Charleston with even more questions than answers. The slave quarters stood, as they always had, in silent defiance of explanation, and the stories of the strange happenings continued to spread, each new theory only adding to the growing sense that something far more profound was at work. As time went on, the slave quarters in Charleston, once a place of intense curiosity and whispered rumors, began to fall into a state of decay that mirrored the growing isolation surrounding it. The rumors about the supernatural occurrences had taken on a life of their own, spreading through the city like wildfire, feeding off the fear and fascination of those who had heard the stories. But despite the increasing number of witnesses, the attempts to rationalize or explain the strange happenings, and the fear that had gripped the community, the questions surrounding the quarters remained unanswered. What was happening within those walls? What was causing the disturbances that defied every logical explanation? And most importantly, why was the area slowly being abandoned? The town's elite, who had once considered the slave quarters a part of Charleston's proud history, began to push the building and its dark associations into the margins of public consciousness. The initial shock and intrigue that had surrounded the place faded into a deeper discomfort. Many of the former residents and workers, those who had lived in close proximity to the quarters, found themselves increasingly unable to cope with the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded the place. Those who had once passed the quarters without a second thought were now crossing the street to avoid it, and as time wore on, fewer and fewer people dared to walk anywhere near the building at night. It wasn't just the physical deterioration of the structure that led to its eventual abandonment. It was the psychic weight that the slave quarters carried, an invisible burden that hung heavily over the entire area. Those who had witnessed the unexplained phenomena felt the effects long after they had left the vicinity. The nightmares, the feelings of unease, the sudden bouts of anxiety, all of these psychological consequences began to take their toll on the once vibrant community that had surrounded the quarters. The fear was not something that could be shaken off easily. It clung to the people like a second skin, a constant reminder that the place held something that could not be understood, something that could not be tamed. The local authorities, once eager to dismiss the strange happenings as mere superstition, began to grow concerned. They were still unwilling to accept the idea that the quarters might be haunted by the restless spirits of the enslaved, but the persistence of the disturbances could not be ignored. There were reports of more people becoming ill after spending time near the building, headaches, dizziness, fatigue, and a general sense of unease that lingered long after they had left. Some workers, who had spent years in the service of the plantation owners, began to exhibit strange behaviors, including violent outbursts and erratic actions that left their families in fear. The local police force, always stretched thin, could not find any logical explanation for these strange events, but the community's unease only continued to grow. It wasn't just the physical state of the quarters that was collapsing, it was the entire social fabric around it, as if the land itself had begun to reject the presence of human life. In response to the growing fears, the plantation owners began to abandon the area. Once a hub of activity, the slave quarters became an empty shell, a hollow reminder of the dark past that had given birth to its existence. As the economic pressures on the plantation system began to change with the gradual rise of abolitionist movements and the growing demand for freedom, Charleston's slave economy began to crumble. The plantation owners, unwilling to face the implications of their past actions, opted to leave the area, relocating to other parts of the city or seeking refuge elsewhere. The former slaves, many of whom had been forced to work the land for generations, were either freed or driven away. The slave quarters, once filled with life and activity, became increasingly isolated, left to decay in the shadows of the city's wealth and power. But as the physical presence of the building faded into the background, the stories surrounding the slave quarters only seemed to grow stronger. Despite its isolation, the place was never truly abandoned. It lived on in the memories of those who had witnessed the strange events, in the whispers passed down through generations. The more the building was abandoned, the more it seemed to take on a life of its own, a place that could not be erased, no matter how hard Charleston tried to move on. As the years passed, there were occasional efforts to repurpose the slave quarters, to turn it into something more palatable for the modern world. It was briefly used as storage, then as a shelter for the homeless, and even as a place for some local artisans to practice their crafts. But no matter what purpose it was given, the building seemed to retain its haunting presence. Those who worked or lived in the quarters after its abandonment reported strange occurrences, each more disconcerting than the last. In some cases, workers would hear the sounds of footsteps behind them, only to turn around and find nothing. Others reported the flickering of lights, or strange figures moving in the corner of their vision. The building had been left to rot, but its influence over the surrounding community had not diminished. The power it held was not physical, it was psychological, spiritual, an intangible force that affected the minds of all who came near. By the time the 20th century arrived, the slave quarters had become a ghost of Charleston's past, a symbol of the city's darker history, one that had been largely forgotten by the mainstream population. Yet, for those who had lived near it, the memory of the place was still very much alive. Those who had experienced its strange effects found themselves unable to forget the sensation of dread that had clung to the air. They could still recall the sound of the whispers, the oppressive weight of the atmosphere, the way the building had seemed to draw them in and hold them captive with its dark energy. And though Charleston had moved on, seeking to rebuild and redefine itself in the years after the end of slavery, the memory of the slave quarters haunted those who had known its secrets. In time, the building was abandoned entirely, left to fall into ruin. No one came to visit, and few cared to remember. The slave quarters, once a vibrant and significant part of Charleston's history, had faded into obscurity, a relic of a bygone era. But for those few who knew the stories, who had heard the whispered rumors of strange occurrences and unexplainable phenomena, the quarters were never truly gone. The building might have crumbled, but the legacy it left behind was far from forgotten. And so, the slave quarters stood, slowly vanishing from the public's memory, but never fully erased from the collective consciousness. The truth of what had happened there, of what had been buried beneath the walls, remained elusive. No one could ever say for certain what had caused the strange occurrences, whether it was the restless spirits of the enslaved or something more mysterious, something tied to the very land itself. But one thing was certain, the slave quarters had left an indelible mark on the history of Charleston, one that would linger long after the physical building had crumbled into dust. The strange secret within those walls had never been fully uncovered, and perhaps it never would be. It was a place lost to time, but not forgotten by those who had lived in its shadow. In the aftermath of the strange occurrences that plagued Charleston's slave quarters, a deep silence descended upon the area. The building had been abandoned, and the city had moved on, eager to sweep away the haunting legacy of its past. The grand mansions that lined the streets of Charleston's historic district were now viewed through a different lens, one that sought to distance them from the ghosts of slavery that had been tied to them for centuries. The memory of the slave quarters, too, began to fade into the city's collective subconscious, buried beneath layers of time, shame, and the relentless push forward into a more modern, progressive future. And yet, despite this collective attempt to forget, the people who had lived near the quarters, who had felt the weight of its dark energy, could not escape its influence. The slave quarters were no longer a visible presence, but its aftermath continued to ripple through the community. Those who had lived and worked nearby, and those who had experienced its eerie presence firsthand, found themselves haunted by a lingering sense of unease that could not be easily explained away. It wasn't just the residual fear of the supernatural, it was the emotional and psychological toll of living in a place that was tied to centuries of suffering, a place where the brutal realities of slavery had left a permanent scar on the land. It was as if the trauma of the past had been seared into the very fabric of the city itself, and though the slave quarters had been abandoned, the emotional residue of that trauma could never truly be erased. For those who had grown up in the shadow of the slave quarters, the silence that followed its abandonment was deafening. The stories of hauntings, strange occurrences, and feelings of dread became little more than whispered memories, passed down from one generation to the next. The younger generations, more focused on the present than the past, found it easier to dismiss the stories as exaggerated or the result of overactive imaginations. They didn't want to remember the dark history that had shaped the city, and certainly, they didn't want to acknowledge the ghostly presence that lingered in the corners of their history. But for those who had lived through the events, the silence was a painful reminder of something that could never be fully explained or understood. In some ways, the silence surrounding the slave quarters became its own kind of haunting. The building may have crumbled into ruin, but the lack of closure, the unanswered questions, left behind a sense of unfinished business. The stories, though buried, refused to fade away completely. Every now and then, someone would mention the strange occurrences in hushed tones, but the conversations were brief, cautious. Those who had lived through the terror of the slave quarters did not want to dwell on it, but neither could they forget. It was as though the fear had been woven into the very fabric of their lives, and no matter how much time passed, the memory of the place would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. The silence in the community grew louder as more and more people chose not to speak about the past. The city had evolved, and Charleston had worked hard to present a more polished, respectable face to the world, particularly as the South was struggling to redefine itself in the wake of the Civil War and the end of slavery. The old, painful history that the slave quarters embodied had no place in this new, forward-thinking Charleston. The past was buried, and the focus shifted to the future. But for those who had known the truth of what had happened in the slave quarters, the silencing of the past was deeply unsettling. It felt as if the community was not only trying to erase the events, but also the suffering that had occurred there. The physical building had vanished, but the emotional weight of its history refused to be forgotten. In the years that followed, the area around the slave quarters became quieter still. Some of the old buildings nearby were demolished to make way for new development, and the once thriving neighborhood fell into disrepair. The city's growing population, largely unaware of the dark past that had shaped the area, moved further away from the once infamous quarters. It seemed as though the ghostly remnants of Charleston's slave history were being slowly but steadily erased from public memory. Newer generations, born in the years after the Civil War, grew up in a Charleston that was proud of its wealth, its elegance, and its cultural significance, but they had little connection to the dark legacy of slavery that had shaped so much of the city's development. Yet, despite the city's efforts to move forward, the stories of the slave quarters never entirely disappeared. Occasionally, a new wave of tourists would wander through the old parts of town, drawn by the charm and mystery of Charleston's historic district. Some would stumble upon the remnants of the abandoned slave quarters, and though the building itself had long since collapsed, the stories still had a way of creeping into conversation. A local guide, eager to tell the tales of the city's past, might share the haunting accounts of those who had worked in the quarters, describing the strange noises, the flickering shadows, and the unsettling feeling that had once gripped the area. But the stories were no longer told with urgency. They were told as if they were little more than a curiosity, an oddity from a bygone era, disconnected from the modern Charleston that existed today. This quiet acceptance of the story as an almost forgotten ghost of the past mirrored the community's reluctance to fully confront the brutal reality of slavery that had built the city. The slave quarters, though no longer a physical structure, had become symbolic of the collective amnesia that many in Charleston chose to embrace. The emotional scars of slavery, of the suffering that had taken place on that land, had been hidden away, buried beneath layers of time and denial. But for those who had lived through the terror of the slave quarters, the silence was a reminder that the past had not truly been erased. The pain, the trauma, and the fear remained locked away in the hearts and minds of those who had been affected. And in the quietest moments, when the bustling streets of Charleston slowed and the night crept in, the memories would come flooding back. The sense of dread, the chill that had once settled over the slave quarters, lingered in the minds of those who had once felt it. They may have tried to forget, to move on, but the silence was always there, a heavy presence, impossible to ignore. Despite the silence, despite the attempts to bury the past, the slave quarters had left an indelible mark on Charleston. It had become part of the city's history, and no matter how much the city tried to erase it, the stories would live on. In the end, the aftermath of the slave quarters was not just a tale of strange occurrences, it was a story of denial, of the unspoken truths that had been hidden from view. And though the building itself was gone, its legacy remained, etched into the fabric of Charleston's history, a dark secret that would never be fully silenced.